Nationwide, crime is dominating the headlines here in America. The Council on Criminal Justice says violent crimes have become more common over the past 4 years. In the first half of this year, the U.S. had 24% more murders than the same time frame in 2019. And car thefts are skyrocketing, up 104% over the last 4 years. Washington, D.C. leaders say the district is in a state of emergency due to the high crime rate. Compared to 2022, Washington has seen a 37% increase in violent crime this year alone.
So basically, violent crime is everywhere. You turn on any news broadcast, any honest news broadcast, you read any honest newspaper, online paper, and you'll see the issue. You'll see the reality that crime is spiking all over the country. But the issue is how do we remedy it? What do we do? What can we do to stop it? That's the question that everyone is asking. The unfortunate reality is that there are many who honestly seem like they don't care. But there appears to be others who, okay, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm messing around with my social media stuff, making sure everything's working. But there are others also who seem to really want to remedy this issue. So the question is, what do we do about it? How do we stop this increasing crime rate that is decimating many of our cities? In particularly, I would say many of our more left-leaning, if we want to look at it politically, cities. So I recently came across this article that discusses the issue of crime, and they came up with a unique way to potentially combat it. So I want to share this article with you. I'm going to read this article through, and I'm going to share with you some of the more interesting takes, I would say, that they came up with, and get your thoughts. I would love to know what you think. So feel free. Again, excuse me, y'all. I'm messing around with the social media feed, making sure everything's working here. But feel free to chime in the chat and let me know what you think as I read this article. I won't be with you long today, but I found this article to be very, very interesting. So let me make this as big as I can so we can read through it. And again, feel free to comment in the chat. Feel free to chime in if you're watching this live in the chat, or if you're watching this later on in the comment section. But this is from the City Journal, and it speaks on shaming crime. Rather than glorifying and excusing law breaking, the article goes on to say, the headline, this co-headline, Americans could learn something from Asian culture's attitudes towards such behavior. So we're going to get into the issue of, so we're going to delve into the issue of culture and how that relates to the issue of crime. Controversial, absolutely, but I think the conversation is very necessary. And let me know if y'all can see this, if you can see this article headline really well. If not, I will adjust it and shrink down my big old head. Let me go ahead and do that anyway. Make sure you guys can see it as we read through this. American social media is normalizing crime, especially low-level offenses such as shoplifting. Millions, for example, have viewed posts of digital content creator Boonk Gang, never heard of the guy personally, stealing shoes, not paying for haircuts, and even abducting live lobsters on platforms like Vine. And I didn't even think Vine was still a thing. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it is. I don't know. Instagram and Facebook. The creator's arrest for robbing a Dunkin' Donuts in 2017 only inflated his popularity, fueling a semi-successful rap career. Meantime, American youth absorbed the message that not only is it okay, and maybe even funny to steal, it might also boost your career. This is an incredibly destructive message. And let me comment on that just a little bit more. You remember a few years ago that Catch Me Outside chick who was on the Dr. Phil show being all ghetto, white girl being all ultra ghetto, talking about her mom had her on there, and I guess she was struggling with how to deal with her and her bad attitude and poor behavior. Ultimately, come to find out that as time went on, that show and those clips went so viral that ultimately she ended up branching that off into a rap career and becoming and making tons of money. So this article is not wrong when it talks about how many can benefit from poor behavior, especially in this current social media age that we're living in. Okay, let's continue. Even more recent than Boom Gang was the rise of the notorious Milwaukee-based Kia Boys, aptly named after their primary auto theft target. These American youths steal dozens of cars per day, taking advantage of software vulnerabilities in the South Korean cars. A YouTube documentary about the group posted last year has garnered well over 7 million views and spurred a Kia Boys trend, prompting countless posts and videos shared across TikTok, which detail instructions on breaking into hot wiring Kias. Now that's just crazy, honestly. People talk about harmful content, especially nowadays. You hear that term being tossed around, harm and being offensive on social media. I'm not sure what people are doing. I'm assuming the social media big tech or companies are doing something about this trend, but it's crazy that this is even a thing. It's utterly insane. I saw recently where in Chicago, the mayor of Chicago was trying to sue Kia, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was Kia or Hyundai, because their vehicles were easy to steal. Instead of doing the reasonable thing and saying, hey, let's punish these young people out there who are out here robbing and stealing. No, this guy decides, hey, let's sue. Instead of being harsher and tougher on crime, the mayor of Chicago decides he wants to sue the Kia and the car dealerships or the car companies. You're talking about having your priorities mixed up, and people wonder why certain cities are so jacked up. There's a prime example right there. All right, have the kids no shame? These trends highlight how far as a society we veered from the idea that shame might spur better behavior. A society that greets thieves with applause and not social ostracization is dystopian. I agree. It also suggests a grim future for America's international standing. While America's youth consume petty crime and hot wiring tutorials, Chinese social media, fraught as it is with censorship, very good point that he brought up, promotes educational content, science experiments, and museum exhibitions to young people. Now we're talking about completely different cultural ideologies. And he's going to get more into this as we proceed, especially when you compare a communist totalitarian nation like China to the United States. Now, as far as it is that we've drifted off of many of our constitutional rights and how we have a tendency to want to shift and drift away from that because we want to be inclusive and we emphasize aspects like equity and nonsense like that. We still are a constitutional republic, as broken as it may be, and those aspects are very encouraging and very helpful. And it makes a clear distinction between us and many other nations. But again, it still doesn't move us away from the fact that there are many people, there are many societies, many cultures that wouldn't tolerate half the nonsense that we do when it comes to the things that we provoke and encourage amongst our young people, especially nowadays. This dichotomy gets to the heart of a key component to crime prevention that has been largely absent from our national conversation. Culture. Now, here's where the controversy starts. It's not controversial to me. I've long said and thought how culture plays a major role in a lot of the problems that we're dealing with today. He continues, crime is prevented not just through law enforcement, but also through the message would-be offenders absorb and how society feels about criminality. Yes, culture can be harder to shift than laws, obviously, but we need to bring culture into the national conversation. Unless we do, we will find it impossible to reverse our mounting crisis of violence and disorder. Now, you would think that something as reasonable and rational as the points he's making right here, the effects of culture and on crime, violent crime, petty crime, whatever it may be, but it does play a role. Our society has shifted to the point, just rewind the clock back to 2020. You can go even further than that, but 2020 was such a pivotal year, I believe, in our society when it comes to the issues of culture and the things that we tolerate. When everybody was up in arms, going nuts about George Floyd. I mean, the whole nation, the whole world was shut down unless you were out there protesting institutional racism. And then you were free to go out there. Churches were closed. All kinds of businesses and shops were shut down. Many people lost their careers, lost their jobs. But if you were out there protesting what was tolerable and accepted, the acceptable narrative that we're dealing with institutional racism and things like that, then you were okay. But if you went against the grain and you wanted to meet, you had pastors being locked up. You had people being locked up for going to the beach by themselves. People being locked up, being arrested for going for a walk, going to the park. Utter insanity. So that's where we are. And then as time went on, the protests, well, not as time went on, it pretty much started right away. Burning and looting and all kinds of destruction that happened across the country, across the world in many places, but especially here in the United States. All kinds of looting and ridiculous things went down in order to justify criminal behavior. And when confronted, many news outlets and civil rights activists would speak up. They would say something like, well, some of them would say, I don't condone the violence, but you have to understand these people are feeling so oppressed and unheard for so many years. And what's the famous quote that they love to use from MLK, that riots are the cries or the voices of the masses, or something along those lines? It's something like that. But what we saw was a society that justified violence. CNN reporting on it, fiery but mostly peaceful protests. You had Chris Cuomo from CNN talking about when a protest supposed to be quiet or peaceful, whatever. You had all of this kind of nonsense out there. So slowly but surely, over years, our culture shifted from where something like this would be considered intolerable decades ago, yet now was considered acceptable. It was understandable. At least that's the narrative that we were being told. All right. Consider again the comparison with Asian countries. The contrast between the norms and messaging of Asian and American communities, and of Asian countries and the United States, and our respective crime levels starkly illustrates culture's role in curbing crime. To understand this type of analysis, scholars like anthropologist Richard Nisbett has created the quote-unquote guilt, shame, fear paradigm to compare accountability mechanisms in different societies. And again, this is where the controversy begins, because we're going to get into how the fact of, because there are a lot of arguments, there are a lot of claims that people make in regard to who is more prevalent in the area of violent crime and why. But again, we're going to get more into, and we're going to see if those claims really hold water. As a matter of fact, I'm going to link, as once this show, the live is over, I'm going to link another live I did going into more detail on this very topic, the issue of poverty and crime. All right. In debates around the guilt, shame, fear spectrum of cultures, the United States is typically classified as a guilt-based society. Asian countries, on the other hand, such as China and Japan, view accountability through a general shame-based lens. What is the fundamental difference? Within a guilt-based culture, an individual behaving antisocially is generally expected to disprove internally of his own actions, to hold himself accountable. In a shame-based culture, on the other hand, members of the community or wider society hold someone accountable for his actions, regardless of his own feelings or right and wrong. Prevention is grounded in potential social consequences for the offender and even for his family. Shame, unlike guilt, utilizes both self-censure in the sense of the individual wanting to maintain his status and social accountability. Now, those points are huge. Let me go back and reread some of the things that he said, because he made some really good points. He says in the debate around, in the first section here, in the debate around the guilt, shame, fear spectrum of cultures, the United States is typically classified as a guilt-based society. Asian countries, on the other hand, such as China and Japan, view accountability through a general shame-based lens. What is the fundamental difference? Within a guilt-based culture, an individual, here's a point I wanted to point out, an individual behaving antisocially is generally expected to disapprove internally of his own actions, to hold himself accountable. And that's where the issue falls, unfortunately, in our modern society. When we have a culture that basically slaps the hand of the offender, sets up laws to where no bail holds are no longer a thing, makes the assumption that we're dealing with institutional racism every time a minority is locked up, then we open the door. And then we also create a culture where the youth are glorified. This whole anti-bullying thing, I think, has had such a greater, what's the word I'm looking for? Had a bigger agenda in their mind. I think ultimately there's a lot to do with a lot of the issues we're dealing with when it comes to sexuality in our modern culture today. I think that played a big factor. But we live in a society now where the idea of offending someone is one of the greatest evils you could ever do. And so, and a do you culture. And it's like, what's your truth society? And a society that basically says that truth is relative to the individual. By what standard do we nowadays view anybody's making the claim that they should feel guilty for things that they did, when truth is relative to the individual? And in a society that has drifted further and further away from God, that has become more atheistic, more self-centered as a whole, where love your neighbor was one of the primary mantras, even as we failed on so many levels as a society, no question about it. But we established a set of standards in our nation over the years, in decades past, that enabled us to be able to shift and move away and self-correct as time went on. But nowadays, all one has to do is just look. Again, we started this off by sharing some statistics about crime in our nation. And those statistics are basically breaking it down, how far we've gotten, to the point to where we have many cities across our nation are discouraging their police and security in many of these places from actually doing anything to stop these criminal activities. You have smash and grabs happening everywhere. So where in a culture as far as we've drifted as a culture, as we've grown increasingly godless, and I think more and more people are waking up to this reality in a society where there is no ultimate accountability other than laws. And when your laws have become so lax and slack to the point to where police officers are barely doing their job because they're not being encouraged, or where they're being criticized every time they are placed in a situation where they have to use a high level of force, you are setting the groundwork for a failed society. No question about it. So I don't know why anybody would assume or even think that or even think that we can have a culture where people are basically wanting to self-correct. I just don't see that being the case. I just don't see that happening. But he references also, in a shame-based culture, on the other hand, members of the community or wider society hold someone accountable for his actions. And I think to some degree, largely, that's where we used to be, to some degree, regardless of his own feelings or of right and wrong. Prevention is grounded in potential social consequences for the offender and even for his family. Shame, unlike guilt, utilizes both self-censure in the sense of the individual wanting to maintain his status and social accountability. And I think that's why you see in many Asian cultures, you see honor being spoken of a lot. The family members feeling as if they're being dishonored. And that is enough often in many situations, obviously not always, but in many situations to keep people in check. But again, here in the US, that's almost entirely gone. Let's move on. There's some more data that I really want to get in, so I'm going to try to move through these other areas a little quicker. Americans of Asian descent are dramatically less likely to commit violent crime. And here is the crux of this entire video, the time I'm spending with y'all today. Americans of Asian descent are dramatically less likely to commit violent crime than any other racial group. Experts often attribute this to social economic factors. Asian Americans are the wealthiest, most educated racial demographic in the country. But as Barry Latzer has noticed in the City Journal, and this is a video that I referenced a few months ago that I will put in the comment section below after I'm done with this video. But here he goes to make his case. 23% of Asians in New York City live in poverty. 23%. That's a pretty large number. Tied with Hispanics for the highest poverty rate among all racial demographics. Make sure you're paying attention to that, y'all. 23% of Asians in New York City live in poverty, tied with Hispanics, not blacks, but tied with Hispanics for the highest poverty rate among all racial demographics. Despite this, New York City Asians commit both violent and nonviolent crimes at rates magnitudes lower than either Hispanic or blacks. NYPD crime data for 2020 is still broadly representative of these trends. And here is where we get into the details. Violent crime arrests per 100,000 of major social groups in New York City in 2020. Oops, sorry. Let me make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. I really want y'all to see this. Violent crime rates per 100,000 of major social groups in New York City in 2020. Violent crime arrests per 100,000 of major social groups in New York City in 2020. Asians make up 14.3% of New York City. And they are 23%, as I referenced above, of 23% are in poverty. Per 100,000, there are 1.2 murders, 3.4 rapes, 20.8 robberies, 6.2 assaults. Now let's see how that correlates in comparison for blacks. Blacks make up 23.8% of the population in New York City. 19% are in poverty. Murder, 10.5 out of every 100,000. In comparison to Asians are 1.2 per 100,000. Blacks are 10.5 per 100,000. So so you're looking at 9 times, roughly, 9 times the rate. Rapes, almost 4 times the number. Robberies, 10 times. That's probably over 10 times the number. Easily over 10 times. And assaults, 51.4 assaults per 100,000 in comparison to Asians are 6.2. Let me read some of the other stats. Whites are 31.9% of New York City population. 12% are in poverty. 0.46 murders per 100,000. 1.4 rapes per 100,000. 14.9 robberies per 100,000. Assaults 8.3 per 100,000. Latinos, 28.9% of the New York City population. 23% are in poverty, again tied with Asians. Murder, 4.6 compared to the Asians, because that's our primary focus. Nearly 4 times the number. Rapes, 9.0 compared to Asians, 3.4. Robberies, 20.8. Asians, for Latinos, 99.7. And Latinos, again, for assaults per 100,000, 33.6 compared to Asians, 6.2. And these are the one, and if poverty is taken into consideration, which it should, in order to understand this, we can, if we look at nationally speaking, Asians have a different mindset, but we're looking at a local number. We're taking a local number, we're breaking it down, we're comparing ethnic groups to ethnic groups, and we're trying to figure out what's going on. And here we see a massive cultural difference, massive. So why is that happening? What's behind all that? Let's move on. Let's continue. If the explanation were purely socioeconomic, there wouldn't be tenfold greater murder and robbery rates for Blacks than for statistically poorer Asians. Even accounting for the greater population of Blacks in New York City, the disparity is huge. This pattern of Asian law abiding, irrespective of wealth, is also apparent at an international level when we compare with America, those Asian countries that are poorer on a per capita basis. For example, China's GDP per capita was $9,905 in 2018. The same year, the US GDP per capita was $62,823, more than 6 times China's per person output. Despite this staggering difference in wealth, the same year, China's homicide rate was roughly 0.5 per 100,000, while in the US it was roughly 5.0 per 100,000. Now, I just want to throw this in there. There could be a lot of factors in there. How readily available, and I'm not justifying this, but how readily available are guns in a place like China. Now, there's still an argument to be made when we look at the city of New York and compare it to other cities and the other ethnic groups who are economically better off here in the U.S. But that was just a question I had when I first read that, as far as using China as a comparison. Similar, albeit less pronounced, the relationships can be seen when comparing Taiwan, Japan, South Korea to the U.S., considering these international comparisons and localized domestic numbers. Socioeconomic explanations for crime seem questionable at best. And I will give them that. I do want to continue to reference or throw into question or ask the question, what factor does the availability of guns, but at the same time, we're not just talking about gun crime. We're talking about all crime. So maybe it's not the factor that I was making it out to be. It could play a role, but we're not simply just talking about gun crimes. Other factors come into play too, notably the far harsher punishments for even low-level offenses in Asian countries like China and Singapore. I remember years ago, the whole Singapore caning, man, I think that was, what was that? Was that in the 90s? I think I think I might have been in the army still when that dude got caned. The Singapore caning thing, the public caning. American went over there, acted a fool, and got caned in public. Deserved it, honestly, in my opinion. But it goes on to say, but those countries' societal relationships with shame also dictates their citizens' behaviors. Even inspiring, I would argue, their exceptional punitive sentencing policies and deter crime by means beyond just citizens' fear of stringent punishment. Homogeneity is often offered as an explanation for lower crime rates in such nations. Now, I don't even know what that word means, honestly. So maybe because they're more, I'm assuming, well, I was thinking monolithic might be the word if it's because they were all like mostly the same ethnic group. But anyway, if somebody in the chat could look that word up for me, I'd appreciate it. Let's move on. But even if homogeneity reduces crime, Singapore, like most other Asian nations, is more religiously and ethnically diverse than many U.S. cities. Yet America's 2018 homicide rate was about 2,400% higher. Wow. Arguably, the shame-based cultures can bind citizens across demographic groups. In the end, neither wealth, penal code, nor ethnic or cultural homogeneity satisfactorily explains Asian countries and communities' low rates of criminal offending. Rather, it may well be the Asian culture of shame. It is not uncommon to see walls of shame in Asian retail stores displaying photos of shoplifters. Singapore's Yishun Mall posts shoplifters' faces and physical descriptions. Many stores even annotate these posts after the perpetrators are brought to justice. Being arrested doesn't get you your picture taken down. Yeah, we have similar. As a police officer, when I would go to certain areas or certain stores, and I would interact with the store owner, somebody was there shoplifting. Oftentimes, they would have images and pictures of shoplifters on their walls, so when they come in, people can pay attention. Maybe they would have them trespass or whatever, or just to alert the store security or anyone in the store, just to kind of keep them aware of what's going on, loss prevention. But it sounds like these folks take it to a whole different level. That's what it sounds like. Of course, cultural shame can go too far. In Japan, in the mid-90s, the father of serial killer Tsutomu Miyazaki publicly disowned him for his string of heinous child murders, refused to pay his legal fees, and ultimately killed himself. Wow. Yeah, that's the part of the Asian shame that's definitely taking it too far. Such grim reaction. Now, I'm talking about him killing himself, but saying you disown your son and you refuse to pay their legal fees, especially doing something as heinous as that, I can understand that. I can definitely understand that. But taking it so far as to want to kill yourself, nah, that's on a whole different level. Such grim reactions puts an extreme burden on already suffering families, right? Though they likely make an impression on prospective criminals too. And I would argue that as well. If you know that you're going to face public shaming to the point to where you might get disowned, ostracized by your family, that could be a deterrent, enough of a deterrent in some cases to keep the kid from wanting to, or the individual, not just kid, keep them from wanting to do harm, wanting to commit crimes. None of this is to argue that we can or should inculcate such mores fully in the United States, but America could integrate aspects of shame culture into our storied melting pot. Well, and I agree with that. While avoiding the despair that it can cause at the extremes, we need at least to admit that cultural normalization of theft, as we're seeing nowadays, and other antisocial behavior has a disastrous impact. And we should teach individuals to hold themselves accountable by demonstrating that our society believes crime is shameful. But again, where are we right now as a society? Do we honestly believe crime to be shameful? You heard a lot of people talking. I had family members and friends say, "Oh, that people's insurance can cover their houses being burned down or their stores being burned down and looted. It's no big deal." But it's a big deal to the individual when that's all you have, when everything that you have has been destroyed, especially in light of the George Floyd case and all these other incidents where it was these people reacted foolishly. They overreacted. Now, as crappy as that whole situation was with George Floyd, there were the way the local police agency, the state responded in bringing those officers to justice. There was no need for the response that we got. Then you got Jacob Blake, people rioting, destroying property over a guy who ultimately ended up fighting the police when we came to find out, and he was in possession of a knife when he got tased. He was and walking towards his vehicle. There have been so many overreactions in recent years, so many overreactions, and people responding and reacting emotionally instead of thinking things through reasonably, thinking things through rationally. Time and time again, we have seen people just reacting, especially us, Black folks. And because we have been manipulated by the media. And if you don't believe me, watch the last live I did. I did a live last week where it's basically a college professor brings up the statistics and numbers, the data of police shootings of unarmed individuals, police shootings of Black unarmed men. And there was a public narrative that people believed, and then there was a reality of what really went down. Got a comment right here. The quality or state of being a similar kind of, or of having a uniform structure or composition throughout. Okay. That's, what was the word again? Now I forgot. Let me go back and look at the article real quick. Was that homogeneity? Yes. Thank you very much, Rosalind. I appreciate that. Homogeneity, the quality or state of being of a similar kind or of having a uniform structure or a composition throughout. So when I was thinking monolithic, I think that I was kind of in the right place to some degree. The fatal outcome could have been avoided. I totally agree with you there, 100%. My issue I had was just the outrage. I can't know. I'm not saying the outrage was wrong. There was the levels that many folks took it, destroying property. That was just ridiculous. That was just unnecessary. And especially, I mean, it was the week wasn't out, and the guy was in jail. And then the other officers as well, if I'm not mistaken. But I think that this article, now it's not perfect, but I think that if we could do, and of course, creating a culture, especially nowadays, when you have this ultra woke, this very social justice oriented society, it would be really tough to do that. Because you have family members being ostracized on the other end. If a parent, if a child believes that their kids aren't woke enough, or quote unquote anti-racist enough, then they'll ostracize their parents. I think Elon Musk was talking about how his kids one of his daughters barely even talks to him nowadays because she's been indoctrinated. He sent her to this very ultra woke school, and he paid the price for it. It's very unfortunate, but that's happening around the country, and it's happening all over the place. So it would be really hard to battle and fight against that, to develop a society, to influence a culture, to really use the principle of shame to get kids or to get people to live right. But I think this article here basically destroyed the idea to some degree that economics are the primary reason why we see such a high crime rate in certain communities. I would also argue, as I've done it, and many other people have done it far more eloquently than I ever have. But when you hear people talking about the impact of fatherlessness, broken homes on various ethnic groups, when you see the impact, when you see that blacks have a higher likelihood for a child to be raised in a fatherless home, they're seeing, and then when you see all of the psychological damage that flows from a broken situation like that, to me, it makes far more sense that is the primary problem. And that is one aspect that really needs to be fixed and rectified if we ever want to see our society improve in that area. But there's also the issue of, again, going back to the issue of morality, when morality is relative and there is no ultimate right, there is no ultimate law maker, lawgiver. You're the sole arbiter of truth in your life. Unless we have a major shift ideologically, I would say primarily, unless we have another great awakening where people come to the knowledge of, stop suppressing the truth of God, then we're going to continue to see this be a problem. But I would love to know what you guys think. I'd love to know what your thoughts are. So make sure you comment down below in the comment section and in the chat if you're watching this live. Let me check out Rosalind's other comment. That was an excuse for others to lash out with their anger. Absolutely. And it was an excuse to make it look worse than it was. And I'm not saying that the George Floyd incident wasn't horrendous. It was terrible. But I'm talking about all the other issues related to that. People are saying, oh, this is just from decades of oppression amongst blacks and mistreatment, and people are lashing out. No. We have a system, as flawed as it may be, I don't think there's any better system in the world than the U.S. legal system. Now, we're really in a downward spiral nowadays, no question about it. But when you look at it as a whole, the structure, and ultimately you need righteous people or people with some semblance of morality in order to have a fair system. Because if people don't have the right morality and they can't even articulate what truth is, how can you expect them to go into a court of law, whether you're talking about the judge, the jury, the DA, the defense, or whomever, and do their job justly? If their moral system is broken, it's almost impossible. But I thought that was a pretty interesting article, y'all. Let me know what you think. Again, comment down below. Rosalind got some great comments. I really appreciate you chiming in here. I was about to let y'all go, but I really want to get her last one in there. FYI, Chicago has a new police chief, Larry Snell, was confirmed earlier today. Good Lord, man! We need to pray for that man, that brother. I'm not familiar with him. I don't know if he came from within the department or if they got him from somewhere else, like the last one we had, who was a former chief of Dallas. That brother lasted about 2 years, maybe, and he was gone. But that's a horrendous system. That's a horrendous city to work under. They couldn't pay me enough money to work in that city. Being handcuffed by the mayor and the governor and all those people, oh no, couldn't pay me enough. The Bible says, where there is no vision, the people perish. Amen. Amen. 100%. And that's basically what we see. That's what we're happening. That's what's happening nationwide. I truly pray for revival, and I pray that it begins with us. What Scripture says is judgment begins in the house of the Lord. So we, as the body of Christ, we need to make sure that we have our act together, that we're faithfully proclaiming truth. And it's not going to be easy. In a society like this, a secular society like this, man, oh man, it is an constantly uphill battle. to proclaim biblical truth. I just posted a short yesterday. It's getting a fair amount of views. And man, it's like the God haters came out of the woodwork to mock and to try to belittle and shoot down the words that were the content that was being stated. It's like they wait to pounce. And I can't help but think that these people are demonically inspired. They don't even know it. I mean, some do, but many of them don't even know it. Very sad. But see, he said he grew up his name is Snelling, and he grew up in Chicago. Okay. Well, maybe he knows what he's getting into, but we'll see. But once again, y'all, I appreciate y'all being here with me today. I will be, Lord willing, I'll be with y'all again as far as a live goes on Friday. There's another article I want to address. There is talks about Blue City residents rally for aggressive policing. It's a Daily Caller article that came out a few days ago, and I really want to discuss that. So once again, Lord willing, stay tuned for that. But as always, in the meantime, stay safe, God bless, and make sure you join the conversation. Take care.